Hello, this is Rue for the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and welcome again to 16-Bit Gems. Most people are familiar with the Castlevania series, and if they aren't, they really should be. The little tyke that started out as a string of popular action games and grew up to become a revered franchise of adventure platformers. Many of the games were great, some not so much, but there's definitely some missing history here that many gamers have overlooked in that strange transition period that gripped the series in the mid-90s. So let's take on the most overlooked masterpiece in this series. Castlevania! Rondo of Blood! Okay, I'm never doing that again. Now, there are two things that make this game pretty special. One is that it's made for the TurboGrafx-CD. Back in my TurboGrafx-16 retrospective, I mentioned how the console had a bit of a confusing heritage. The nominally 16-bit system with an 8-bit CPU. Amazing, I know, but marketing departments can be dishonest.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
Yeah, the video chipset was 16-bit, so at least it wasn't a complete prevarication. Regardless, the TurboGrafx did have a huge, if expensive, leg up on Sega and Nintendo since it was the first video game console to have its own CD-ROM peripheral. First introduced in Japan in 1988, the PC Engine CD-ROM, renamed TurboGrafx-CD in the US, introduced games that essentially used the TurboGrafx-16's processing power to run everything. But the added storage size of CDs, typically 650 megabytes, compared to turbo chips, less than 1 megabyte, allowed much more data to be stored in each game. For the most part, these were audio files, which allowed symphonic quality music to be used in video games for the first time. However, video data could also be stored, which was used to a less than desirable effect in many full-motion video games of the era.
Be careful, that's Mad Dog's boys over there.
Chaco! Show them what we did in trouble.
Luckily, some developers also figured that you could squeeze a lot more traditional video game graphics onto a CD, like sprites and backgrounds, which, with the additional onboard RAM in the TGCD, allowed for some amazing graphical leaps from the humble TurboGrafx-16. Though its $400 price point and lack of a huge library kept it from being widely accepted, hell, that's even a hill Sega couldn't climb, the TurboGrafx-CD does have its share of fans, and many would agree that Castlevania Rondo of Blood became one of the shining jewels in that add-on. Now, if I were you, I'd stop watching this video right now, because vanity is a sin. But I'd also be wondering, what a crock of lait poo-poo! Pardon my French. Why is he reviewing a CD add-on game for a quasi-8-bit system? Well, alright, this is really stretching the term of 16-bit gem here, but this is one of the best games ever released for the platform, so I don't really care if I strain credulity a bit here. The other thing that's special about this game is that it came about at a pivotal turning point in the Castlevania series. Castlevanias 1 through 4 were straight-up action platformers. Well, 2 was a bit of an oddball, but in essence, action platformer. 6 years after the last of those came out, Symphony of the Night was released on the PlayStation in 1997. Everyone who's heard of Castlevania likely knows about this game. It was the one that changed the standard formula for the series from action to that, "Hey, you got Castlevania in my Metroid!" "No, you got Metroid in my Castlevania!" adventure platformer type of game.
Delicious.
After that, generally all the main series Castlevania games copied that strategy and moved on to greener pastures in the portable realm, a franchise reborn. During those intervening 6 years in the 90s, however, essentially only 2 new games were released during this period. One was Bloodlines, a game for the Sega Genesis that came out in 1994 and strayed a bit from previous titles in a few ways. Now, it was still an action platformer, but you had 2 different characters to choose from right at the start, one with the requisite whip and the other with a spear. The story actually took a page from Bram Stoker's Dracula instead of the established Belmont mythos. There weren't even any named Belmonts in the game. Instead, the main characters began in Castlevania, but then traveled around Europe in order to prevent the resurrection of Dracula amongst the backdrop of World War I. However, the gameplay was familiar and solid. A rather linear game, it nonetheless pushed the Genesis to its technical limits and is generally regarded as a worthwhile entry in the Castlevania line. The other game released during this period was Akumajo Dracula X Chi no Rondo, which, according to Google Translate, means Akumajo Dracula X Chi no Rondo. According to useful sources, this translates to Devil's Castle Dracula X, Rondo of Blood, or as the English-speaking world has come to know it, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. This game was highly regarded. It won awards, critical acclaim, fan praise, which makes it all the more amazing that this game was played by almost nobody outside of Japan back in the day. What's the reason for that? Well, it wasn't originally released outside of Japan, for starters. Coming out right before Halloween of 1993, it became a big hit for the well-established, in Japan, PC Engine CD-ROM. Unfortunately, due to the general disdain the rest of the world held toward NEC's peripheral, Konami never bothered releasing it for the TurboGrafx-CD overseas. Now you may think you've played this game on the Super Nintendo, under the title Dracula X, or Vampire's Kiss in the PAL territories, but you'd only be partly right, by which I mean wrong. Dracula X was a stripped-down port of the original game, released 2 years later in 1995, that had to make compromises in order to constrain itself to the Super Nintendo's technical limitations. And also reportedly because NEC didn't like the idea of Konami making an exact copy of their hit for other consoles. The difference between the CD version of Rondo of Blood and its SNES counterpart are evident. There are the obvious bits, like lack of video cutscenes and non-CD quality music, but several other changes were made to the gameplay. I'll be pointing those out as I come across them during the review. In the end, Dracula X for the Super Nintendo is a darn good game in its own right, but it's no Rondo of Blood. Alright, so let's get to the game, shall we?